All right, let's do this. Today, we're taking a deep dive into India's economy.
When you've come to the right place.
You've got that big meeting on India coming up, right?
Yep.
Well, we're going to get you prepped using the latest Economic Monitor report from the Boston Consulting Group, BCG, for those in the know.
It's a fascinating report. It's full of contradictions, honestly. We're
Oh.
going to be looking at record highs and then like some unexpected dips
Ah.
and get this consumer sentiment. It seems to be telling a different story
Yeah.
than the actual hard economic data.
So India's economy, it's keeping everyone on their toes.
Yeah.
Let's unpack these mixed signals. Let's start with the different sectors. What jumps out first?
Well, the industrial production figures are definitely eye-catching.
Okay.
The IIP, that's the index of industrial production, it's showing a big surge, mostly driven by the electricity sector.
Ah, interesting.
And this actually lines up with a pretty noticeable increase in power consumption.
Well, yeah, more economic activity, more energy you need, right?
Makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But here's where it gets kind of interesting.
Okay, lay it on me.
The report also highlights that steel consumption has hit an all-time high,
Really?
like the highest since January 2019.
So what's driving this? Is it like infrastructure projects?
Yeah.
A booming real estate sector? Or is it something global happening?
Honestly, it's probably a mix of everything you just said.
Yeah.
Increased government spending on infrastructure, that's definitely playing a part. And we can't rule out global demand.
Right.
To really nail down how much each of those factors contributes, well, that'd be another deep dive all on its own.
I like the way you think. But hold on, the report also mentions a dip in both diesel and petrol consumption.
Yep, there's that.
So industries are booming, but fuel consumption is down? That doesn't seem to add up.
It's definitely a head scratcher, isn't it?
Yeah. Are we seeing a shift towards, I don't know, alternative fuels maybe?
That's possible.
Yeah.
The rise of electric vehicles, especially in commercial fleets, that could be playing a role. And then there's always the impact of global oil prices, right? I mean, they can really influence what people are doing at the pump.
For sure.
We need to dig deeper to really get the full picture, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
It really highlights how interconnected all these economic factors are.
Yeah.
Okay, so industrial growth, but some puzzling trends in consumer behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's switch gears to the auto sector.
Okay.
This looks like a bright spot, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The report shows really strong growth in the auto industry overall, especially when it comes to passenger vehicles.
Interesting.
January sales were record-breaking,
Wow.
like the highest ever recorded for a January. So that suggests, at least in that sector, consumers are still spending.
A new car is a big purchase, though. I mean, that shows some confidence in the economy, right? But is it sustainable?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
It could be pent-up demand from the pandemic years finally coming through, attractive financing, new models hitting the market. Those could be playing a role, too. Whether it'll last, well, time will tell, but right now it's looking good.
So far, we've got this interesting combo of industrial growth and some, confusing trends in what consumers are doing. Let's talk trade and investment. What's the story there?
It's almost like there are two separate stories going on. On the one hand, the merchandise trade deficit has gotten wider. This is connected to that decrease in petroleum consumption we were just talking about.
All right.
Less demand for petroleum means fewer petroleum products being exported, and that adds to the deficit.
That's a pretty straightforward link, but is there more to it?
Of course.
All right.
While merchandise trade is struggling, the services trade is absolutely booming. Exports of services have surged, leading to a record surplus.
So India's carving out a space as a global services hub. What's behind this surge?
It shows how strong India is in areas like IT, software development, business process outsourcing, all that. There's a huge global demand, and India is in a great position to take advantage of it.
It's almost strategic, like they're leveraging their strengths. Now, what about foreign direct investment? What's happening there?
Well, FDI is a little more complicated. There was a spike in December, but overall, FDI in 2024 was down from the year before.
So it's not a clear-cut case of everyone's rushing to invest. What factors are influencing these decisions?
Global economic uncertainty, that's a big one. When the global market is volatile, investors get cautious.
Right.
And then there's always geopolitics, right?
Yeah.
Investors are always watching, and global events definitely have an impact on their perception of risk.
It sounds like India's trade and investment landscape is full of both opportunities and challenges, right? There's no simple answer.
Exactly. And to make things even more interesting, let's dive into BFSI,
BFSI.
Banking, financial services, and insurance.
Ah, right.
A mouthful, but a vital part of any economy.
Absolutely. And the report highlights some pretty interesting trends there.
Oh, yeah. For example, UPI transactions are still going up, hitting another all-time high.
The UPI, that's the Unified Payments Interface, right? It's a real success story for India in the fintech space.
For sure, it's revolutionized digital payments, and its popularity just keeps growing.
It's incredible how UPI has become such a part of everyday life in India.
Yeah, you see it everywhere, from street vendors to big stores.
Yeah.
And it's not just about convenience either.
What do you mean?
It's driving financial inclusion, bringing millions of people into the formal financial system.
That's huge for accessibility. But the report also mentions a little dip in mutual fund assets under management, or AUM, after they hit a record high in December.
Yeah.
Is this a sign of investors getting cautious?
Maybe. Remember all that market volatility we talked about earlier?
Right.
That volatility is reflected in the VIX, which basically measures expected volatility in the market. When the VIX is high, investors tend to get a little more careful with their money.
So the drop in mutual fund AUM could be a reaction to those jitters in the market.
Could be.
Interesting. And then there's this, a slight increase in insurance premiums, mainly driven by growth in health insurance.
Right. Another interesting point.
So is this about people becoming more aware of health risks, or are there other things going on, like changes in healthcare policies?
I think it's probably a bit of both. Healthcare costs are going up. Plus, people are more aware of health issues, so that might be pushing them towards insurance.
It shows how economic trends can reflect changes in society and demographics, too.
Exactly. The economy isn't just numbers. It's about people and their choices and how they interact with the world.
Well said. We've covered a lot, but I feel like we've only scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore.
Oh, there's plenty more.
We'll be back with part 2 of our deep dive to unpack those macroeconomic indicators, including inflation and GDP growth forecasts.
Looking forward to it.
Stay with us.
Yeah, don't go anywhere.
All right, we're back, and we're ready to dig into some of those macroeconomic indicators.
Yeah, let's zoom out a little and look at the big picture. See what these numbers tell us about the health of the Indian economy.
Sounds like a plan. What's first on the list?
Well, let's start with inflation.
Okay.
The report says that both WPI and CPI inflation eased up in January.
For anyone listening who isn't familiar with those terms, WPI is the wholesale price index, which looks at price changes at the wholesale level.
Right.
And CPI, that's the consumer price index, which focuses on prices for everyday goods and services.
Exactly.
So for our listener who's getting ready for that big meeting on India, this means the prices of things they buy every day are going up at a slower rate.
Yeah, it's a welcome break for businesses and consumers.
For sure.
But what's interesting is that the report says this easing of inflation is mainly because of lower food prices and the cost of energy going down.
So it all ties together. Okay, so easing inflation, that's good news.
Definitely.
What other macroeconomic indicators should we look at?
Let's look at the Purchasing Managers Index, or PMI.
PMI, okay.
This basically tells us about the level of economic activity. And here's where we see another one of those contrasts we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
The manufacturing PMI is up because there's a lot of international demand for things made in India.
Makes sense.
But the services PMI actually went down because of weaker growth in new business.
So manufacturing is doing well, but services are slowing down.
Yeah, it's an interesting difference.
What could be causing that?
It might be that global factors are having more of an impact on services.
Okay.
Like imagine if global IT spending slows down.
Right.
That would hit India's IT services sector pretty hard.
It just shows how connected India's economy is to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And how those global trends can really affect things.
Absolutely. Okay, now let's talk about government revenue.
Right.
The report mentions a pretty big increase in GST collections.
GST, that's the goods and services tax, right?
Yep, a major source of income for the Indian government.
So more GST collections means more money for the government to invest, right?
In theory,
Infrastructure, public services, all that good stuff.
yeah, things that can boost economic growth.
Okay, so more GST is generally good news.
It's usually, yeah.
Okay, so we've covered inflation, the PMI, and GST collections. What's next?
Let's talk about people.
People.
Yeah, employment and how people are feeling about the economy.
Right, because at the end of the day, it's people who are affected by all these trends.
Exactly. So the report has some interesting data on this. For instance, the overall employment rate dipped a little in January,
Not great.
but MG and Regie employment stayed pretty stable.
For those who don't know, MGNREGA is the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act.
Yep.
It's a government program that guarantees work in rural areas.
Right. So even though the overall employment rate went down a bit, that safety net from MGNREGA helped soften the blow, especially in those rural communities.
That's helpful context. But even a small dip in employment isn't ideal, is it?
No, not really. But we
Yeah.
need to look at the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Employment rates go up and down. That's normal. It's too early to say if this dip is something to worry about or just a temporary thing.
We'll have to see what happens in the coming months.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's talk about how people are feeling.
All right. Sentiment.
Are people optimistic or are they worried about the economy?
Right.
Well, this is where things get a little strange.
How so?
Even though inflation is easing up, consumer confidence has actually gone down.
Really?
Both the Future Expectations Index, or FEI, and the Current Situation Index, or CSI, they both show a weakening trend in January.
So even with prices cooling down, people aren't feeling as good about the future.
It's a bit of a puzzle, isn't it?
Yeah.
There are a few things that might be going on here.
Like what?
Global uncertainty could be weighing on people's minds.
Right.
Even if events around the world don't directly affect India, they can make people anxious. And then there are domestic factors too, like job security and the cost of living.
So it's like a bunch of uncertainties all coming together, making
Yeah.
people feel a bit uneasy.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So with all these mixed signals and everything going on, what does it all mean for the overall outlook?
Yeah, what's the forecast for India's economic growth?
Well, the report says most forecasts for FY25 GDP growth are still between 6% and 7%.
So even with all the ups and downs and uncertainties, India's economy is still expected to grow at a decent pace.
That's right. India's got a lot of long-term potential.
Okay,
A young and growing population, an expanding middle class, and they're making economic reforms.
that's good to hear. But I guess there are still some areas that need to be watched closely, right?
Definitely. We need to keep an eye on those mixed signals we talked about, the difference between manufacturing and services PMI, the dip in employment,
Yeah.
and how consumers are feeling.
It's a reminder that the economy is always changing.
And staying informed is key.
Absolutely. Watching how these trends develop, both in India and globally, that'll give us a clearer idea of where things are headed. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into India's economy. You know, going through all these indicators, it really strikes me that India's economy is like a giant puzzle.
I know you mean all these pieces connecting and influencing each other.
Right. It's not enough to just understand each piece on its own. You have to see how they all fit together.
Yeah, it's like you think you've got the puzzle figured out, then you find another piece, and it changes everything.
It's a constant process of analyzing and adapting. Right. That's what makes navigating the economy so tricky.
But so interesting, too.
Before the break, you mentioned a question, something to really get our listener thinking about these trends. What is it?
Well, considering all the different things we've talked about, some sectors booming while others are struggling, what should businesses really think about when they're deciding whether to invest or operate in India?
That's a great question. It's not a simple yes or no, is it?
Definitely not. Businesses need to be smart about it. Do their research, understand the specifics of each sector and region. There's no one-size-fits-all answer.
So it's all about being informed, being flexible, and maybe even being a little bold.
All of that. And I'd add one more thing. Being picky.
Picky.
Yeah, focusing on areas where India's strengths match up with their own goals and what they're good at.
Don't just jump on the bandwagon, but make strategic choices based on what you know.
Exactly. And that's really why we do these deep dives.
To give our listeners the information they need.
Yeah, whether they're investors, business leaders, or just want to understand what's happening in the world.
So there you have it, our deep dive into India's economic roller coaster. We've looked at the good and the bad, the chances to grow, and the challenges. Hopefully you've got a better grasp on this complex and ever-changing economy.
It's been great unraveling these economic trends with you.
And a big thank you to you, our listener, for joining us on this journey. Remember, in a world where things are always changing, knowledge is key.
It really is.
Subscribe to The Deep Dive for more explorations of the fascinating forces shaping our world. Until next time, happy exploring.